clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong, learn to do right. And then comes this verse. Seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Now, in case God's people missed that, he comes back to that very same theme on verse 23. Your rulers are rebels, companions of thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them. Now, here is a truth that came out of this passage that confronted me. Yes, people of God at that time were very pious. They were very religious. They did the things God asked of them. However, when it came to their horizontal relationship with other people, they were failing rather miserably. And particularly in the area of how they dealt with people who were particularly vulnerable, people who were defenseless. God was angered. Because when you study the background study of that time, this was a time when Israel was particularly enjoying a time of abundance and prosperity. There's a growing group of, so to speak, middle class and upper class people, but at the same time, while they were enjoying that kind of abundance, they in fact in many ways exploited other people of the same tribe, simply because they were the defenseless, the poor. And this had greatly angered God. Perhaps you had read this passage before. I don't know how this passage escaped my attention up until then. I began to ask myself, so rather than pointing my judgment fingers at people of Israel at the time, how am I doing in light of what this passage is asking from God's people? Oh, I grew up in a Christian home. In fact, my dad was a pastor. Went to church all my life. I think I had a fairly disciplined practice of reading God's Word, praying every day. Yes, I was not making a whole lot of money, but my wife and I made an early commitment from early days of our marriage that we will give 10th of our earnings to God's work. Those things we were doing fine in. However, then, I came to that verse 17. Seek justice. And then it says, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead for the case of the widow. Seek justice. How am I doing in this area? God forbid that I am doing all these pious things, but still provoking God's anger because I'm not seeking justice. Now, it's not that I did not understand what justice is or injustice is. After all, I studied urban sociology as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago. Those studies exposed me to various forms of inequality in our society. I learned that as an undergraduate. But however, when it came to my Christian life, that thing that I learned during my undergrad years were sort of safely detached. That's something for the government to deal with. That's something for judges and attorneys and others who are involved in community work. They need to deal with that. Me as a Christian pastor, that's not my concern. I think one of the reasons why I might have thought that during those years is because, hey, as an Asian American, I wrestle with and encounter various forms of racism in this society. I don't oppress others. I feel like, if anything, I am a victim of a social injustice in this society. Maybe another reason is having grown up in a rather poor immigrant home, where my dad, as a pastor of a small church, had to supplement his income by serving as a janitor at night time. I mean, me and my younger brothers, we always, and sisters, qualified for a free lunch program when we were growing up. So always identifying ourselves as a people at the lower end of social-economic strata. But I feel like oppressing others? Me? Of course not. If anything, I feel like we grew up in a setting where we're feeling the economic and other forms of pressures and oppression. So this passage really doesn't apply to me. So I follow. You know, whatever reason I might have had why I did not really pay attention to this strong teaching in the Bible, where God calls God's people to care about justice and seek justice, I think that day in a retreat, I began to wrestle with this thing in a very new way. And coming out of that retreat, I made a commitment to go through the whole Bible again and look at this theme of justice. Whether or not it's one of those marginal secondary themes, or is it something that our God really cares about? In other words, is this passage one of the anomalies in the Bible? Or is it a theme that is consistently in the Bible and somehow I fail to acknowledge it? Well, you know, when I do a more systematic study of the Bible, do you know in the Old and New Testament, there are up to 1,060 references to justice. 1,060 times the word justice is mentioned as something God that demands from God's people. Contrasting that with 90 times that the sexual sins are mentioned in the Bible. Okay? But isn't it true that often in our teachings or preachings that we hear, there is more mentioning of sexual sins than sins of injustice? Where does that come from? Do you know that when you read the whole Bible, there are basically two sins that are regularly mentioned that God's people committed, and when they do so, that provoked God's anger almost right away? From Genesis to Revelations, you know what those two sins are? One is sin of idolatry, that is worshiping something other than God. And the second is oppressing the poor. And when you think about it, that makes sense, because sin of idolatry and sin of oppressing the poor are the other sides of the two greatest commandments that God has given us. And some of you know what they are. To love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The opposite of that is idolatry. And then loving your neighbor as you would love yourself. And remember how Jesus redefined who your neighbor is? That's where he used the parable of Samaritans. Jesus wanted to make sure that his followers don't have in their mind when Jesus said neighbor, it's someone who looks like me, someone who lives next to me. That's not what Jesus had in mind. In fact, the farthest thing is true. For many of the Jewish people at that time, the Samaritans were the ultimate other. And Jesus intentionally picked Samaritan to redefine what neighbor is for us. Someone who is different than you, and someone who is in desperate need. And oppressing the poor is a flip side of our loving neighbors as we would love ourselves. Well, when you look at it that way, you can see why